All right, we should start. Williams, anything you want to say at the outset? Pitch in with your mouth full.
We're ready to go.
So today's meeting of the BC Tax Revision Commission is focusing on learning lessons of the 2013 commission. And we're fortunate to have several both members and staff of that commission with us today, as well as some notes about how tax revision commissions have worked in other states. And then, depending on how much time we have towards the end, I'm hoping to have a little bit of a conversation about what it means for us and get your feedback on some discussion drafts of documents I've put together to lift up some of the guiding principles to guide our work and some policy options that we've started to accumulate a list of, and some research projects that we'd like to undertake in the coming months. So with that, Becky and Mayor Williams have put together a great panel discussion. So I'm going to turn it over to, I guess first we're going to have a presentation from Richard us here from Urban Institute, Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center and the Urban Institute, talking about both the 2013 Tax Commission and tax commissions around the country. Richard was a staff member for the 2013 commission and has also done a number of work with a lot of the other commissions. So with that, just take it away.
Sure, it's easier if I stand up. We're gonna sit down, or what's the best way to do this?
This is the mic.
It's the mic.
I'll say so. Sitting's probably good.
All right, let's rock and roll then. So first, everyone, thank you so much for inviting me to be here. Thank you, Nick, for that very nice introduction. It's a pleasure, as I've been watching a lot of your meetings, now get to contribute to them. So thank you for letting me sit at the big kids table. As Nick said, and if Mike wants to scoot back a few slides back to the second slide. Just so we know each other, my name's Richard. I work on state and local tax policy at the Tax Policy Center. That includes studying other tax commissions like the one you're serving on. And I worked on the 2013 commission as staffer. To my right, it's my other colleague, Kim Rubin, who also works at the Tax Policy Center. She's the director of the State and Local Finance Initiative, and she was a commissioner. She did your job on the last commission. With my time today, what I kind of want to do is first, I want to go broad, talk a little bit about other tax commissions, how they fail, how they succeed, what can we learn from them, and what can we hopefully take from them to improve this tax commission. And then I want to do a brief overview of what I learned from the 2013 commission and what I think will be good lessons for this group. But then also, I also just want to take some time to talk about how that previous commission struggled. I think when we often talk about the 2013 commission, we correctly talk about the fact that a lot of its recommendations became law. But I don't want to get the false impression that it was just easy sailing the entire time through. In fact, it's the opposite. And I hope that will teach you some lessons and maybe even give you a map forward as you kind of design your own recommendations and proposals. All right, Mike, so if you can jump past the review overview to the first slide. Just overall, why are you here? Very existential question, but why are you at this table? State tax commissions are created basically as a way to go outside of the legislative process. We put out a report in 2016 that took a look at 31 state tax commissions, and Kim and I had personal experience assisting tax commissions most recently in Colorado and Kansas. One of the most important elements of a tax commission, and something that I think you'll see reflective of this commission if you take a look around, is a diversity of opinion. These commissions are purposely put together to bring together multiple points of view to see if they can reach points of agreement on good ideas for the tax code. But that said, the fact that you're outside of the legislative process, the fact that a lot of you have areas where you disagree with each other, speaks to how inherently challenging your task is. You're pretty much always asked, the commissions, both you and others, are asked to do work that the regular legislative process either cannot do, such as really look long term at some tax issues, or that they might not want to do, which involve making really tough decisions. A lot of legislators, not speaking to DC Council, but generally speaking, like commissions because it's easier to make hard decisions when it's been endorsed by a group like yours. You give a lot of weight to those ideas. And then finally, something just to keep in mind throughout this presentation, tax changes are really hard to get implemented because tax systems are more than just policy. They're more than just, pros and cons and good ideas. They're rooted in history and tradition. And so again, this job is just challenging from the jump. Mike, can you go to the next one? So having looked over a bunch of these things, you can kind of see some patterns. And tax commissions I'll just put them in three buckets. Some of them go really, really big. For example, a California commission in 2009 recommended that California completely eliminate its corporate income tax and its general sales tax and replace it with a business net receipts tax. Commissions in Georgia, Kentucky, and Louisiana all kind of put forward the same commission, which was we want to either completely eliminate or greatly reduce our individual income tax and replace that revenue with a larger general sales tax more on consumption than on income. Then there is a second bucket where commissions kind of go more targeted reforms. And of course, these span a wide range of policy ideas. But some pretty common areas include, reducing tax rates, increasing a standard deduction, eliminating tax expenditures. Then there's the third bucket that just doesn't propose anything at all. Sometimes these commissions just say, we'll give you some good ideas on best practices. Other times they'll give ideas, but not really give the details. And that's a good segue into how do state tax commissions fail? It's a little harsh, that's my judgment. But I would say first and foremost, a commission fails when it does not make detailed and actionable policy recommendations, because you are not giving policymakers tools. For example, a very, very common thing, and as someone who read almost 25 plus state tax commission reports that drove me insane, is when the report would say something like, as all good tax policy experts know, we must broaden the base and lower the rates. And it's like, if we all know that, then why are you saying it? And even more, infuriating, they would then go on to not tell us how to broaden the base. A lot of these reports actually did tell us a lot of ways to lower rates, which legislators are happy to do for you. But on that keyword, like tax expenditures is key one. A lot of reports will say things like, oh gosh, we have this big tax expenditure report and it has all these tax expenditures and there's all this money in there. There's got to be something, and it's like, well, geez, maybe if they had a commission to go through it and pick out the ones that weren't good and weren't bad, we can maybe get somewhere. Another areas of concern, not engaging with political opponents and political reality. Two commissions that stood out to me was one in Minnesota, which was created by their then Republican governor. They heard from a bunch of conservative viewpoints, and shockingly enough, they recommended tax cuts. And it was a very nice put together report, but it was DOA when it got to the Democratic legislature. Conversely, there was a commission in Massachusetts, appointed mostly by Democratic members of their legislature, pretty much only heard from progressive advocacy groups, and then surprisingly enough, recommended tax rate increases. That also didn't go somewhere. This is another thing that is just really hard about your job. In a way, you are supposed to be non-political. You're supposed to just look at the facts and come up with good ideas. But what you're producing then immediately goes into the political arena. And so I think groups that understand that and don't put it at the forefront, but maybe always have it in the back of your head that an elected official is eventually going to have to act on this. I think they do the best job of putting forward proposals that have a chance of going forward when it gets into that place. And speaking of that, in the next slide, we can talk about success stories. Something to know, again, to jump ahead to the 2013 commission, which was really was like a career high mark for me. It was just incredibly part of something that made changes in the way the district operates in such a positive way that was so almost universally embraced. That's rare.
Yeah.
It's really, really rare. I looked at some 20 to 30 commissions I looked at 30 commissions. Some of them are still going. So I think I read 26 reports. The ones that got pretty much most of what they offered was DC and an earlier Massachusetts commission. So not to get everyone's crushing its hopes, but saying that you're gonna do that again, that's a really, really high bar. I think though that what commissions that succeed do is they smartly lay out in great detail a list of policy solutions. I also think, and this was something that we did in 2013 that we were cognizant of, you all will put together a package of ideas, and it should be a package because you're going to talk about pros and cons, giving and taking. But it helps when you, like, we talked about those commissions like in California that had such big changes. When you put forward something that, if the council did want to take apart, they could. That was true in 2013. They didn't take all of our, recommendations. But I still think that the best thing that you can do is when you propose something, not to give it too much of a gloss, not to talk it up too much as the transformational change, but talk about the advantages and the disadvantages. Be clear on winners and losers and tie things to revenue changes. Because again, this goes back to the idea that this at some point does become a political document. If you don't do it, then they have to. And if you don't paint the picture for them, it just inherently creates obstacles to them doing this later. And then, it's to get more optimistic, something that is also seen, just as common as a commission's list of recommendations not getting swiftly put into action, it is common that if you give it a few years, legislators pick them up. They literally pick it up off the shelf because the political situation changes, the economic situation changes, and all of a sudden they go, didn't we hear from a commission that said that basically laid out what we're talking about right now? And they'll come back to it and making sure, again, creating this like policy map for officials to look at, consider, and come back to. I think that's where commissions really succeed and do the job that they were asked to do. What's next? Okay, cool. The 2013 commission. Back to a successful one. That commission, we call it the 2013 commission because that's when it made its recommendations in December 2013. But as Mayor Williams can tell you, that went on for a while. It started in August 2012. The recommendations were approved in December 2013, and the final report wasn't published until May of 2014. 2014. The report was published in 2014, right, which was the same month that the council enacted a package that was very, very close to a list of recommendations. Some similarities, that was obviously a very different group, but it looked, if you looked at the background of the commissioners on the 2013 commission, it looked a lot like the background. The council and the mayor again done a good job of bringing in like diverse points of view from different experiences, not just points of view, but from backgrounds of public sector, private sector, to a table to get people to bring those ideas together. And we also had a very similar progress where, we heard from expert presentations. We also had 3 public hearings, and all of that kind of culminated in the fall of 2013. And this is kind of where you can kind of look into the future and what you're going to kind of do, although Nick and Mike get to do it our way they want to do it. The way we did it was that once we started, after we had the meetings that you've been having, in the fall of 2013, we began to have meetings where we went over specific policy options. And so on the staff, me was Jerry Whitcomb, Steve Rosenthal, and we produced these policy memos. And we would sit down and say, today's meeting, we're going to talk about all of the policy ideas we've gathered on individual income taxes. And we talked about them and we asked the commissioners, what do you think? Do you like this idea or not? And then as staff, we kind of took that back with us. Those policy memos had come either from the commissioners themselves, from those public experts, or from the public who then testified and gave us ideas. And then we went over those details. We went through the pros and cons. We went through something that's crucial that'll come later, revenue scores. Again, underlining how important it is to think about revenue, because eventually you need to make sure that this is a package that is politically feasible, that has a revenue score that you can pass on to the council and that's going to fit this moment, this fiscal moment. And then in 2013, we were able to unanimously, approve a list of those that we felt both, was in the range of revenue that we had, and that also met, the various goals that we had set out for the commission. And we can kind of go through these quickly. I don't want to bog you down too much into the question. Yeah.
You solely had policy and tax policy, or did you also consider it?
That's a great question. 98% policy. I think, so speaking personally, and we're going to get this, I don't want to like ruin my surprises, but it just wasn't on our agenda at the jump. And I think what happened is a lot of people smartly kept asking about administration. And then we had like one meeting where someone laid out ideas. And I think we ended up presenting 3 recommendations for administration, but we also were very humble in the fact that we were like, look, we just didn't have the time to go into this. And also,
Was that a mistake?
that's where I don't know, because I think that
Are you talking about administration or regulation?
oh, I'm sorry, I'm talking about administration. Were you talking about regulation?
I would say I agree.
Then I don't think we really ever went into regulation. So sorry to,
No, that's not, no, but it's, so you did make it.
yeah, and I will say that again, it was something where, to just sum up, there were other things that we like constantly wanted to get our hands around because we thought the task was so large and there was so much work to do. I do think, just as someone who sat on the sidelines as a non-commissioner, that we did better work on the policy because I thought people's ideas were able to like flow into that and were just grounded in a way that like, I think at one point we were like, well, we need a whole different commission on administration to really dive into this stuff. And so I don't want to sell you guys short, maybe that will be an issue, but it was challenging in a way that the conversations on policy I didn't think were.
No,
Yeah.
but this, because when I don't go into this now, maybe sound, but thinking about our scope, what our scope is, but
Mhm.
also it's hard for me to think about tax policy without thinking about all the other issues that at the end of the day, I think we see economic. It's broader, but it's in us. Period. So how you can focus.
And I will say, so Mike, if you go into if you can jump the first recommendation and go to the second recommendation, like with business taxes, I do think that those conversations led into our conversations. And so something that we recommended was lowering the corporate income tax rate. And one of the points we made in favor of that was, if you put all your studies about tax competition and tax competitiveness aside, the truth is we think that there is a perception about the district that is possibly flowing from these other issues that at least in what we can control on policy can send a message, and that we have done this and we hope that you maybe do more, or that maybe you think to other ways. So this is our way of signaling and telling you this is an important issue.
I feel like if you have those thoughts, like bringing them up and thinking about how they might be able to fit or not, seems valid to me because, partly when we did this, we said we were going to do tax policy and there could be another commission on administration. Well, it's 10 years later, and I'm not sure we had that. And some of the ideas that came out were brought up by other folks, but it is an advantage to sort of trying to get some ideas on the table. So if there are things that are concrete, it could be useful to try to include too, I think.
Thank you.
So I don't want to bore you with all the recommendations that are there if you want to peruse them. I do think the takeaway I hope you get with it is it was a mixed bag. I mean, there were recommendations to, and we'll circle back to this, increase the top individual income tax rate. There was also recommendations to lower the corporate income tax rate. There's expanding the sales tax base to more services. There was increasing the earned income tax credit and increasing the standard deduction. So a lot of different ideas that achieve different goals that were brought forward by different people ended up being on that list. Mike, we can then go to, so we'll get into some of the differences between this commission and that commission. I'll just be blunt on this. Our job was so much easier in 2013. If, I don't want to make you read the entire report, although I love that you have it and possibly took notes in it. That gets me really excited. You read that first page and it's really positive. It's like things are going, there's a vibrancy here. In fact, like what we got to do is we got to ride this wave. We got to create better tax policy because so much good stuff is going on that we got to make sure that we keep up with it and keep it going. Without boring you, I think you know that there's a slightly different situation going on in the post-pandemic. That said, like foremost in our mind was attracting and retaining residents. Talked a hell of a lot about businesses going to Virginia in 2013 too. So there's a lot of similarities on that score. Another one was that about getting into why, I mean, the commission, to the best of my recollection and knowledge, not being a member or inside the DC Council, was that they kind of just punted it over to us. They were like, I know I have council over here, so I have to be careful what I'm saying. There wasn't a real direction, and so it was like, well, we'll have a commission and we'll just let them sort out these things. But I don't remember there being that many crystal clear instructions beyond that. We really had a lot of area to navigate. Whereas again, because of the situation we just inherently find ourselves in at this moment, I think even if they're not explicit, there is an idea of what you need to produce and the way you need to steer this commission to reflect that situation. But I mean, what that let us do in 2013 is we didn't have our goals until we started having meetings. And we came up with 3, which was we found that there was a relatively high burden on middle-class residents. The district's business franchise commercial property taxes were relatively high, and that, we're surprised to hear, it's so resistant. The district cannot tax a lot of business individuals. And we decided those were things. And I think even though you as a commission haven't put your 3 things down on paper, I bet if everyone did a little secret ballot, there'd be a lot of overlap into what this commission is thinking about in a way that wouldn't have been true in 2013. And then, I mean, the 2013 commission's recommendations were really good. Again, I'm very biased. They got implemented. The DC Council has also done a lot of good work since then. And I guess the way I ended up writing this in the slide is like, it's really easy for me to work with the tax commission in Kansas. So I'm like, oh my gosh, guys, okay, where do you want me to start on things that you could do to improve this system? DC's harder. DC's really harder. Like the easy stuff has been done. You are being asked to go through, it's far from perfect, and we've heard people talk about where there's problems and issues, and I don't want to give that impression. But they exist because they're really challenging, not because someone hasn't taken action on the stuff that would have been easy to knock out. And so we're at a point now where you really got to dig deep and think hard about these issues. I can go to the next slide. Now that I've talked up the 2013 commission, I really do think, I mean, maybe this is just me, that because it succeeded, like there's an idea that like it just flew through and things were great and it was simple, but like as a staffer on that was not the case. We don't need to get into the why, because this was more of a staffing thing than a commissioner thing. But the early meetings that we had in 2013 spanned a lot of subjects and really weren't rooted in anything. I've been lucky enough to sit in on some of your meetings, and I think both your expert presentations and the questions and the comments used the commissioners have been making are really targeted. Again, like this is a difference. We didn't have our goals laid out. You do, but you are following them, and you're following these ideas in a way that I don't think was reflective in 2013. Again, for some issues that we didn't talk about. Also, like, I think Nick, to pump up your staff, Nick and Mike, I think you're doing a really good job of going through what y'all have been saying and thinking about how we can craft this into a package that is just far ahead of where we were, at least as a staff in 2013. Also, just again, like disagreement is inherent to this process, and man, we had a lot of it in 2013. You were picked because you don't agree with everyone else on this panel. If you all agreed, the commission would not do anything. It only works because you disagree, because you have different opinions. And in 2013, that led up to our first vote on those recommendations failing. We had a meeting. We walked into that meeting saying, today we are going to unanimously pass a set of recommendations, and they failed. And we had to stop, go back, fix it, and talk to the commissioners and come back again on December 18th and put it again before we got that unanimous vote. I totally blacked this out from my memory, and Kim had to remind me, that one of the major issues was we couldn't even decide what the top rate in DC was. Because the top rate at that moment was 8.95%, but it was set to sunset to 8.5% in 2016. And so a lot of our more progressive members were like, the top rate is 8.95%. So we can just leave it there and not have to raise taxes. A lot of our commissioners that were more trying to make this a more competitive place and more attractive place for business said, no, it's 8.5%. And if you raise it, if you keep it, you're sending a signal that the district doesn't care about its high income residents and businesses because you're just going to keep this up. And you can say that like, oh, we're arguing a number, but as I'm trying to say, those are values that we were talking about. There are values about what we want this tax code to do and for members of its community. And similarly, like you can say this is simple. We eventually set that rate, the recommended rate like 8.75 or 8.7. Like we literally dropped it in the middle. But that required a lot. It required the people that thought it should be 8.9% and thought they needed that money to achieve their goals to give that up. And it required the people that were arguing that the district needs to be a more welcoming place to business to say, no, we are going to kick it back up again. And they both had to give a lot on that before the rest of the package and all those other ideas could come through.
I just want to say it was interesting, and I think this might be a sign of why it was successful. I feel like each half of the people who thought that it should be higher or lower, and when we're talking about what the rate should be and what the rate is, were really interesting conversations. And I don't know if it helped pass the whole thing unanimously, but I think both sides were a little grudging about it, right? So the people who thought it should stay at 8.95 and that wasn't an increase, felt like they gave by having it go down to 8.7 or 8.75. And then the people who were thinking about it as being at 8.5 because that was what the law was, felt like they had conceded some. And so I think it was sort of an interesting conversation that people met at the middle, but also each felt like they were giving and taking some.
Yeah, and I'll wrap up with the last slide on where the 2013 commission succeeded. First, a singular focus on detailed actual policy changes that we came directly to the council that came with revenue scores. Again, we always wanted a cohesive package, but we were very mindful that, you know, having looked at other commissions, they don't always get taken as a package. And so ensure that there are ways, there are off ramps for the council to make improvements to the tax system, even if they don't take every single one. And they didn't. You know, we had a service fee that was a huge part of our package, and didn't. You could say it kind of got turned into paid leave with a payroll tax, but not really. It was different. But we had other ways for them to go through there and adopt those tax changes. Delegating work, we have a lot of incredibly smart people here. Just so we had a lot of incredibly smart people in 2013. We specifically broke out a group of commissioners who were very interested in income tax policy for low-income families that I think came back with ideas. I think other smaller groups can help getting people that are, you know, where that's their issue to go in and work it. But also just giving some space to Nick and Mike to turn your goals and your values into policy, because they're the ones that have the time to really twist it and turn it and make sure it works. And so it represents what you want, but also kind of thinking through some of the decisions that have to be made in any policy choice. And then values compromise, but a unanimous vote. Again, this is really hard. A lot of you have really strong opinions, and I think you need to keep those strong opinions. And I think you need to articulate those strong opinions so everyone knows where you are when it comes down. You know, we had a list of policy options, and then we would color code it, or some were like green. We got everyone's on this. Yellow, I'm not sure, and then we just be like red. We know that this will not fly. We will not be talking about this any longer. This is not for us. But again, no one in 2013 got everything they wanted. Everyone had to give up. Everyone had to endorse a policy that they didn't like, but they also got things that they really did like. And that leads into my final thing. You have another asset in the fact that Mayor Anthony Williams has again agreed to chair this commission, because I think of the myriad things Mayor Williams did for the 2013 commission, one, he kept us focused on actual policy changes. I do want to do one little sidestep here, which is, again, you guys had, you know, maybe bigger tasks at hand than we did. And so maybe you do need to go bigger than we did. But that doesn't mean you can't still do, you know, smart policy changes. Regardless, I think we had a lot of things floating around in the 2013 commission that Mayor Williams was just like a laser, like, how are we going to turn this into a law? how are we going to get this passed and how is it going to have a benefit for the residents and business of DC? But then this also just goes to your unanimous support, where I was lucky enough to accompany Mayor Williams to a lot of his meetings with council members. And I mean, they all like, just beyond excited to talk with Mayor Williams about tax policy. But when it got down to the actual recommendations, what I thought was really strong is that at some point he would say, you put this commission together. You've brought together people from all sorts of different aspects. And I'm bringing you a package that they all said yes to. So why would you say no to it? So again, if you can get to that place, if you can find a way to get to that place, you're really going to have a strong hand to play when this eventually goes and becomes something for the DC Council to pick up.
Well, we're supposed to have a conversation. You have the conversation?
I think it's time for to have the conversation.
So just as so joining in the conversation, we're gonna have, is Jeff gonna be in now or is Jeff coming in later?
I think Jeff's on now.
Jeff DeWitt, former CFO, is on the line from, where are you, Jeff, in Kansas somewhere? I don't want to be.
I'm in Lawrence, Kansas. 2022 NCAA National Basketball Champions and currently third ranked in the country. Just to remind you all.
Richard and I spent a lot of time, well, we spent one visiting Kansas and we spent a lot of remote time in Kansas.
So we're going to have a conversation about Jeff's perspectives, but first we're going to talk about the commission. And I just say, as the moderator, just my perception to add on to what you've said is I think big difference between now and the commission in 2013 was that at the beginning of the commission, we had a compact, if you will, or an agreement or an accord with Ed Lazier, who represented pretty much the opposite end, bookend from where I was, say Mark Ein was, other folks on the commission. And we had an agreement that we wanted this to work. That was very, very important. So we made some agreement, we made some concessions on progressivity. We got Ed, at least in the commission, to agree to, for example, setting our inheritance tax at the federal threshold, 8.75, a lot of major things, so that when we came out of this, we had this kind of agreement, and I hope that we can come to some agreement on our overall outcomes in this commission. I'm not sure, but go ahead.
No, and I was going to say, people have very different opinions, but stayed pretty affable about it.
Yeah.
Like one of the things that came out of this commission that was, a joy to watch, Mark Ein and Ed Lazier as like the odd couple, like genuinely liked each other, felt really different about certain things, but because they had, this respect and like for each other, they were able to, agree to disagree, but also understand where they needed to compromise.
Yeah,
I thought that was.
yeah. What about the economic conditions, though? I mean, it's easy to get everybody to agree on a tax package when revenues are predictably increasing infinitely into the future, and as opposed to now where the outlook is cloudy, to be kind. I mean, talk about that.
I mean, I think, again, when we went looking for ways to improve, as you're both saying, it's a lot of things that we ended up with was like, well, we could inject some progressivity in here. We can lower the estate tax. We can lower the increase. We can not go to the 8.95 on think of that. But we never had. We made sure that the final proposal was fiscally responsible. But we had people saying you should go bigger, because the anticipation was that we had, it was, we, at one point, we traditionally said we had a Santa Claus list when people were given all their ideas for how to cut taxes. And I think it was really, the only constraint there was political. We didn't want to put something to the council that was just such a big tax cut. We wanted at least there to be some elements in there that were tax raisers. But in no way did we feel like we have to pull the city out of crisis, that we have to go finding. We never, when we had conversations about, the local service fee and the idea that a lot of businesses, or buildings don't pay taxes, it was often a fairness issue. It wasn't we need to find revenue issue, or if we found revenue, it would just be plugged back in to these other kind of tax cuts that we were searching for.
Right, and I feel like part of it was also trying to figure out what would make it fair and equitable, and sort of thinking about who is in DC and who you were hoping to keep in DC and grow in DC in terms of businesses and then residents. And how do we survive? Like, I think a lot of things that, from an academic perspective, were sort of on my to-do list, like taxing tourism. Mayor Williams was pretty negative in terms of those jobs were actually good, places for people in DC to get their foot into the economy, right? So, in my mind, taxing people who are tourists seemed like an easy place to go, whereas, I don't think it's telling tales out of school. Mayor Williams sort of pushed back and said, but, you've got to recognize that those hotels beyond, if you put in that hotel taxes, some of those hotel jobs are sort of how our residents come up, which is a valid point and is sort of something that I hadn't really thought about before. And so I think there is this trade-off in sort of thinking about who you're hoping this is going to benefit and how it all fits together is really useful. And then also thinking about the fact that you do have some more luxury to think maybe longer term.
In your view, let me ask a couple more questions. In your view, if you looked at other commissions, who's done a particularly good job on the competitiveness side? And who's done a particularly good job, if anyone, on the addressing the inequality, equity issues?
I think, there was no commission that I would assign as homework that you should go and study these up. Please don't. But having taken the time to read them, I just think that, these themes are constant, more equitable, fairer, competitive, these issues, these words get thrown around in every report. The difference is the report that says, we should be more competitive and so we should slash tax rates and stops there. And the report that says, we should be more competitive. We need to lower this tax because we want to attract this industry. That is going to lower our revenue. And so we have to think of an equitable place that does the homework and, goes under that and paints a picture of how that change and why the change is being made.
And, the stuff we did in Colorado, Colorado was interesting in that we worked and staffed a commission that Governor Polis put together and did some work, and it was very bipartisan, had executive and legislative folks in it. And we raised some issues. At the same time, they were doing work in the legislature where they didn't necessarily take all those ideas, but they used some of the information that was there and put together a policy that got passed. So he was somebody who is very interested in progressivity, but also very interested in competitiveness. And it was an interesting activity. For me, I was on the 2016 California Commission that went nowhere with Taryn right after I was on this commission. And so partly I felt like I was bursting Richard's bubble when he first came to Urban after being on this commission to explain that this was not typical. And so, sort of this trade-off between trying to be broad, but actually being really concrete in what you're proposing is really important. And concrete helps a lot.
You had a question for me?
Can you expand a bit more about the trade-off between being aspirational and being practical? We've had a couple of ideas here that have really been provocative and interesting. And a couple of people I mentioned them to said, oh God, that'll just grind us all up in a big debate, or that's too hard to administer. Give us something simple versus something big. And I wonder, how would you talk to us about the trade-offs there?
To Mayor Williams' point, if we were meeting in 2018, I'd discourage you from going to big ideas. Because they typically, if it was in 2018, before the pandemic, I would have discouraged this commission from going to big issues. They mostly the situation you were dealing with is radically different. And I looked at commissions pretty much just after the Great Recession. And even though that was a bad situation, I think it was different from this. I think you're in a different place. And I think for a group like this, looking at big ideas should probably, I'm not saying should pose, but has to be examined. They have to be in a way that we would have never considered in 2013. And it's It's not that's not about best practices for commissions. That's not about getting things through. That is just simply a recognition of the situation we are in here and how different it is from previous ones.
And
Yeah, go ahead, David, and then Yesham.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, Yesham,
Go
then
ahead.
Jeanette.
This will be quick. So, Richard, what I'm interested in are ideas that you've seen other jurisdictions. Look at this for particular. Very often, we discuss equity. We're only really discussing about how do we further privilege or further advantage a certain income or community in the city, which is often lower income folks. And we can all agree that a progressive system makes sense, that we don't want to overburden lower income individuals. But what I see absent from the discussion of equity is how do you help the women and middle income minorities actually go up the ladder as well? How do you incentivize and make possible business ownership for these communities? And just bear with me for a second, Mayor. There are about 14,000 businesses in this city. I don't think any member of the council can tell you how many of are female owned and how many are minority owned of that 14,000, and how that's changed from 2023 versus 2013 versus 2000. Quality. We have to have a system that measures and recognizes how equity means equity for middle income women and middle income minorities, so they can move up the economic ladder as well. It doesn't mean that we don't focus on lower income communities. It means we start privileging that community. And so, we have a very robust CBE program in the district, but it only relates to government purchasing. And it's not a great program, if I'm honest. We don't, Mayor, you may disagree, you lived in the Valley of the Beast. We don't exactly hold the CBEs to the highest standard. We don't get much beyond, being relying on the $1.1 billion the city goes out. If we were to use the tax structure to offer tax credits and refundable tax credits for our private businesses to go to that CBE list and start pulling from that CBE list for-profit and non-government contracts, you could give a tax benefit to help the middle income, female-owned, African-American, Latino-owned businesses get work outside of the district government to improve the spectrum and expectations of their business, and start adding to the 4,000 minority-owned businesses and the 3,200 female-owned businesses, right? That seems to me something worthy of thinking about in these unprecedented changes about how do we grow this city and start getting to the issues of equity. Long story, but I appreciate, do you have any recommendations or any places we can look at that extended equity to middle income minorities and middle income women? It shouldn't be that hard a thing to try to convince people.
Well,
I
look,
would just, well, do
you don't understand.
like, I don't know if there's a specific place, like, one of the things, if you were gonna try something like that, I would highly recommend that you actually have a big monitoring component to it, in that I feel like there have been cases where in some of the, economic development that we've already seen, you see people sort of taking it, but then not actually, actually following through on the commitments that they make.
They're called nonprofits.
No.
I'm being
I
serious.
God bless, I live in the Line Hotel, right, which is down the street from where I live. Came in, got a pretty nice deal in part. I hope nobody hears and had certain plans to hire certain people that they did not hire in district residents. And so I think it is an interesting idea. I think partly though, figuring out how you're going to follow through if you actually put things like that into place is going to be truly important.
And I disagree, but I was being half serious when I talked about nonprofits, who, and I don't mean to beat up on them. It's not my intent, but, we have entities in the city that don't pay taxes. That's supposed to serve a public purpose that is never measured, where there are no expectations. We give free money to those organizations, some of whom have multi-million-dollar endowments, and there's no accountability. And so what I, want to be conscious of is if we are looking, we all want to see more female-owned businesses and more minority-owned businesses. I want to see people move up the economic ladder. I don't want to hold them to higher standards than we hold everyone else who gets free money. That's just my opinion. And I'm just looking for ideas on how to do that.
So broadly speaking, for making your task incredibly challenging. The first is that I really wish that when you asked me that question, I could was like, yeah, this state did that and it worked out brilliantly. But a lot of the things in my metaphorical file of, simple, efficient tax policy, the district has done. That's why I said it's easier to go to a lot of these other states because they haven't done a lot of the things the district has done. And so when you can pick it out of that file and say, I know this worked. So we're kind of in new territory here. And then the pandemic, again, totally new territory. I really wish that I could come back to you guys and say, wow, New York figured it out. Chicago has done it. They are, running to catch up just as much as DC is. Everyone is scrambling. Everyone is looking for new ideas. I think what that then comes to you, and this gets at the earlier question about regulation. How does tax play a role in that? Because I think something that we definitely talked about in 2013 on a range of issues and that I talk about constantly with policymakers is, okay, we've assessed that this is the problem. We have the goal. Are you sure tax policy is the way you want to achieve it? And if it is, go for it, but be careful because sometimes this is across the political spectrum, across the country. They grab tax policy because it's something they can do and then say, I did it. See, there's that deduction now in your income tax. I solved it.
Yeah.
When you really haven't moved the needle on the thing that you're actually trying to achieve.
But to answer to David, especially what you're saying is, in pushing that, we're in new territory. There's no precedent, but it's not, you shouldn't do it. It's just
Right.
understand that.
It's just not easy.
What are cities like Charlotte, Austin, what are they doing? Are they doing anything? Does feel like cities that are really attracting business, attracting growth, they're attracting middle income. When you go to those cities, middle income seem to be Denver, or cities where you have actually thriving middle or upper middle income that is growing. But are they doing anything where there's any consistency?
So I know Denver, they're trying to figure out what's going on with their property taxes.
Yeah.
So that's where they're seeing the push of things are going up. Something I wanted to add from a comment earlier, and this is different than sort of coming up with a package, is recognizing the uncertainty that's going on right now.
Right.
It might not be terrible to sort of think about whether there are certain ideas that you think should be adopted if something seems like it's going in a certain direction or not. Like, it feels like it's a little premature to know that like all of businesses are leaving or like that people aren't coming back to the central cities. But it might be worth saying, if this is an ongoing pattern and this isn't, a blip, it's a trend, maybe we need to focus more on these kinds of issues. I feel like places like Nashville and like Denver, as we look at them, there's this push me, pull me between having too many people come in, and there's some push about that, and then what they're gonna do in incentivizing how businesses can thrive, and then sort of what does it mean as they go from sort of middle to large?
Through that, right? And I don't know that I'd say we're large, but we went through this where we figured out how to attract people. And now we're what appears on the surface to be, we've lost that traction. And is there anything that we can learn from some of those cities that would just help us through that? I don't know.
I think there's
But I
something.
was listening to David about middle
Mhm.
class, and I was saying, where are we doing business with middle, where I'd say, it's not really thriving in the US anywhere, but where is it thriving right now? And those are places that just happen to fill the mind.
To give the lamest answer possible, like there's a lot of like correlation and causation things that are going on here. And so if you think I think that there are lessons to learn from like lower tax cities and how that they're handling and attracting residents. But there isn't like a city out there that had really high taxes like cut them in half, and then the people started flooding in. It's the situations of with those cities and how they evolved and developed and when they did also fed into that. And so, to my knowledge, and again, a lot of this is just because, I mean, like, governments don't move quick. And the pandemic was only a few years ago. And so there are cities that are doing well. Broadly speaking, like, to just talk off the top of my head, it was kind of just because they were in a good spot and they were ready for this situation. And I don't think it was so much action. But again, to your point, that's not to say that we can't learn from them. It's not to say that we can't scan them and say, what ideas are out there. But it's just hard.
Okay, yes, Sean, go ahead.
I mean, related to what Jody's saying, what we're seeing is just as the pandemic breaks the relationship between where we live and where we work, a lot of smaller metro areas started receiving population. Just the ones, places in Texas, I mean, even places like San Antonio, Tampa, Florida, is really thriving. And I think to bring it back to another point that we were making, for me, the biggest challenge is trying to figure out what the tax base will look like 3-4 years from today. When the last Tax Revision Commission was doing its work, we never doubted that the commercial property values will continue increasing. It's like in DC, imagine Alaska and you wake up one morning and there's no more oil and your severance taxes are down. And I think my question then is, what are some of the tools we can use to think about this? We have resiliency as a core principle, and part of that is trying to understand or trying to do a responsible job in predicting these changes in the tax bases, and I feel completely lost there.
And I think part of it might be sort of looking, and this will get into some of the things Nick, I think, is gonna talk about if we have time left at the end. Like, what are areas that need more research? And so part of it is sort of understanding who DC's residences are and who the businesses are here, and which ones we think of as being more mobile versus less mobile. And what does it mean if they're mobile or not, right? So part of it is it really that the families are leaving? Or is it that, young folks who had their jobs in DC, are the young people not staying in DC and just sort of staying where their parents live after they graduate and they still have their job? So like understanding who it is that DC is losing as sort of residents or as businesses, and then understanding sort of what tasks could be taken to try and
I guess
adjust that. Like,
I mean, just again to follow up on Jody's point, I mean, we didn't have this experience. We had population come back in DC in mid-2000s. It was largely young people, the so-called millennials. They formed families and stayed here, and we started taxing them as their tax, income started increasing. If you look at individual income tax payers, we haven't seen a vast increase in numbers, but
but they've been more.
Exactly. So again, my question is, how do we, if that's our goal right now, especially given that residents are so much more important with commuters not being that important anymore, how does the tax policy play a role in that? And what is like the short-term cost and long-term benefits?
And I think in my mind, part of it is understanding who DC is or what DC is. Like I had a conversation like this with people in New Jersey who were talking about how, their retirees were leaving and, who their age base was. And part of it is sort of recognizing that New Jersey is fundamentally a place where people leave their 20s, leave New York in their 20s and go raise their families, and then move somewhere else to retire. Some of that can be affected by their policies, but part of that is also sort of some of their natural life cycle, and then people come back. And so understanding, and what I don't know is whether what we see after the pandemic has there been a fundamental shift in sort of what the DC residents look like? And, but you also want to recognize that there are certain parts of the DC community who have lived here, right? So, not lower income families that sort of stay put where they are, you want to make sure they have options too.
Okay, so I got a couple more questions for you. One, other commissions, how did they determine the need that had to be satisfied by the tax system? That's an important question. And so you could just say, well, we'll just take the revenue for, budget and revenue plan and we'll just, play to that, or how do we know that's realistic, or how did other commissions deal with that? Go
Sorry,
ahead.
can you repeat the question? I'm sorry, I missed the first part of it.
How do we define the need that our revenue system has to meet? Because if you define the need high, then we're gonna have to have a tax increase. If you define the need low, then, you know what I mean, how do you, how have commissions grappled with that question?
So,
Because we decided as a commission, we really did, and I buy into this now. At first I was reluctant, but I can see how, it'd be like Iraq and Vietnam to try to explore all expenditures and revenues and taxes. That's too much. Revenue, regulations a lot too, but anyway, how other commissions, how do they address that?
so a lot of commissions are tasked with something explicitly. They're told, you must come back to us with revenue increases. Or they're told, you must come back to us with tax cuts. Again, something where like you have the benefit and the burden of this, we're not. You must choose. And so you really can take that in a lot of ways. I will say, I liked it in 2013 that no matter where the conversation led us, we kept revenue neutrality, at least in mind. We ended up producing a tax cut, but we ensured that it was always in the ballpark. Like the council explicitly gave us 18 million and we sent them like a $48 million tax cut. Now we wrote, we think you can go more because of the situation, but it wasn't that big because we wanted to ensure that in the report, we both made arguments for what we felt were good tax cuts and which were arguments for good tax increases. Again, so that if the council didn't accept it all, they could come back to one or the other depending on the circumstances. But unfortunately, I think that is just a path that this commission is going to have to choose for itself among its many ideas is where it wants to go.
Yeah, and I think partly it depends who's putting it together. So in the work we were doing in Colorado, Governor Polis is a highly progressive Democratic
Tax cutter.
governor who happens to feel like Arthur Laffer is his guardian angel. So, which is a very odd set of things to sort of put into place, and was adamant that they needed to get rid of tax expenditures because that's sort of wasteful and, and having to spend time explaining that, tax expenditures aren't necessarily giveaways, right? Tax expenditures include things like EITCs and, not taxing certain things. And so part of it is going to depend on sort of what you think your priorities are and then how it goes. And I think partly some of the other commissions either had a very specific agenda to start with. Richard talked about sometimes they came in and, it almost started before it even began, that the idea was to say, we need to get rid of the income tax. And that didn't necessarily go anywhere. And sometimes it's sort of dangerous. If you think about a place like Mississippi that keeps talking about getting rid of its income tax, even though it doesn't really have a tax base. But sort of thinking about what you think the priorities are and where things should go is going to be really important, I think.
So I have a comment.
Yeah, go
Tim,
ahead.
you were on the commission last time. If you were on the commission this time, what's the elephant in the room?
I think one of the things so for me, a big issue is the uncertainty.
That's exactly.
And the fact that, the reason I'm telling you that I feel like you should have a, pick A or B has to do with the fact that I don't know what that uncertainty is. Not to quote Rumsfeld, but the unknown unknowns are hard. And then we did some of this implicitly, but we didn't actually, we passed the childless EITC, and we expanded that in part to try and help a population that isn't necessarily people who didn't have kids, but didn't have kids who were necessarily living with them. But we didn't necessarily, explicitly take into account race. And I think it actually is a little naive that we weren't thinking about that. And I think that is going to be something that's going to, affect how you're deciding things. So this whole idea of who are business owners and how do you help and who needs what help. And, part of that, before sort of saying that all women, that we're going to give every business a refundable tax credit if they hire these firms. I feel like it's gonna be really important if you wanna go in that direction to have a better understanding of, you know, if we're talking about women and minority owned firms, what are those firms doing? And is the way to help them making it more attractive for other firms to hire them or to do something more directly for them, right? So understanding who those businesses are that you're hoping to help, rather than saying that you're gonna give businesses broadly a tax break if they use these people, just because sometimes things get lost.
Let me ask you this, because I want to get Jeff in the conversation
Yes.
too. Now I will say this, I don't know what you all thought, I didn't think we got any marks for public engagement the last time. I mean, the public hearings were pitiful. It was like open mic, but only 4 or 5 people showed up. It was like just really bad. So any commissions that have done a really robust job at public engagement, soliciting, so for example, on this creation of wealth, let's say, where they have actively gone out and solicited experts on this subject, or, you know, public education, or, you know, good examples out there?
I think it's a low bar and the 2013 commission stepped over it. Look, I agree, and having sat through some of those public hearings was not exactly enthralled, and there are groups of advocates that will show up and put the things that you know damn well what they're gonna say, and then you'll hear 15 people from it say it as if on the 15th time, now I agree. That said, I think what the 2013 commission did, and similar commissions would have done well to do, is just keep an avenue open. Because we did get some things through, like someone random showed up at a hearing, someone sent us an email unsolicited, and wasn't central to us, but it was like, it's a good idea. We could roll that in. It's you kind of got to sift through all the stuff. But as long as you keep that door open, you'll find some stuff. And so I think you have to manage it, like you're saying, you can't just have it be open season.
Yeah.
But as long as you have some avenue, you'll get some stuff that's worth it seeing.
Something that came up not in tax commissions, but I'm doing some work on racial equity and community engagement on other development. And they're figuring out where you should hold and when you should hold your meetings becomes really important, right? So sort of recognizing that different groups might have a hard time coming to meetings in specific places. So, you know, if you want community engagement, having some of it in different parts of the city at different times could also help.
Erica, you have a question?
Yeah, I mean, can you guys hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. I appreciate that last comment, Kim. I think that makes a lot of sense. And just because it hasn't been asked explicitly and you haven't necessarily mentioned it, I mean, you've talked about some other commissions using language around equity and progressivity, but I do think that a question of racial equity in our tax code is different, that it's not 100% overlapping with sort of economic inequality that we might find across DC and in our tax code. And so I'm just curious if you've seen any other states take on the specific question of racial equity and how to like have a more racially equitable tax code. And if so, what that looked like. And if not, you know, sort of, I think Kim, you started to get at this, but how you might go about factoring that in, or like thinking about some of the decisions you all made last time, like what kinds of questions would you have asked yourselves about the policies that you put forward and ended up putting together in a package?
I think that's right. You know, as Richard was saying, DC is sort of on the forefront of a lot of this. So I think places have started, like I know Chicago is starting to think really deeply about issues that have to do with racial equity. San Francisco clearly is. And I think there are issues that places are starting to recognize that there are differences, right? I feel like we did not talk about race, I don't think, and people can correct me
We
if I'm
talked a
wrong.
little bit about when we talked about expanding the EITC to workers who do not have children on their tax return, that would largely disproportionately benefit young Black men who would would benefit from the DC EITC, but not from the federal EITC
Right.
because we expanded it.
And so there are conversations like that. So sort of thinking about what the population is, who you want to help, and whether there are specific types of policies that can help. You know, California, when they expanded, you know, they introduced an EITC fairly late and they had it targeted, and then they expanded it to ITIN holders. And so I think places are getting better at this, but I don't think of anybody who is, you know, I'd say is way beyond where DC is at this point in terms of thinking about the issues. And I think part of this gets hard, and part of what we're doing is struggling with it, is understanding if tax returns don't have information about race, how do you figure that in? And so you sort of are doing it broadly based on characteristics that sort of correlate with that. But it is something that's sort of being explicit about whether there are specific programs or certain policies that can be helpful for specific populations.
Yeah. And I mean, Erica, so I studied commissions pretty much up until 2016. And so I don't think you'll be surprised to learn that before then, this was nowhere. None of these things in the way that we have those conversations now. I think the 2013 DC Commission did the most by even just raising the subject and beginning to think through. I will pivot back to something that Yesem was saying here. I love data. I work at a place with data, more data. I kind of like, we did some case studies in 2013. Now in 2013, that was business. We literally got an accounting firm to go out to businesses and run their numbers for different types of firms. And what that actually showed us is that the DC taxes were pretty damn competitive for a lot of different types of businesses. But what we also immediately learned when those accountants went and talked to people is they said, you know, what do you think? And they're like, DC is the worst by far. And they showed them the numbers, and because of things that they didn't think about, like Virginia's gross receipt tax and personal projects, you know, it's not, and they're like, no way, I don't believe this. And so one of the things we led to us, you know, we knew we couldn't spend the money to reduce the commercial property tax at that time, but we knew sending a signal by lowering the corporate income tax would possibly get people to take a look at DC in a way that we didn't think they were. And I think to Yes's point about thinking about residents, like thinking about different types of families, how, because different families have different interactions with the tax code, and how you can think through and target and, you know, to get those families and help them out through your changes would possibly be smart.
Yeah, so let me ask, bring Jeff into the conversation. Jeff, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. I can't hear you.
Came on in the district as CFO, just as was commission's recommendations were being enacted. What was your experience in the implementation of those recommendations?
Well, as you mentioned, I was going through confirmation in October of 2013, and you were sending me commission reports like every week. I don't know if you remember that, and I hadn't even started yet. But I started in January of 2014, and as was mentioned earlier, your commission final report came out in May of 2014, and immediately Chairman Mendelson took those recommendations and put a bill together. So I had been here maybe 6 months and had a big head start because you kept sending me the information to look at on what was going on. And we were also in the point where we knew we needed to replace our tax system. And so there were several things going on. One, we were putting out an RFP to figure out how and when we were going to replace the tax system, which was an older mainframe system with a phone system that could only answer 50 calls at a time, and all kinds of challenges that technology had brought to us. That was modern when you brought it in, but 20 years later, you kind of need to be replaced. So, so what was interesting was you had given a dollar number. The council had given you a dollar number of how much you could spend, and the recommendations that came out were larger than that dollar number. And I'm not sure. It's too bad Rashad's not still here because I could probably give him a hard time about this. But they did about, and this is my memory, about 25 million they decided to fund in the 2014 budget, but they wanted to do all of them, which were close to another, I'm doing this from faded memory, 75 million, close to 100 million total. So they I, being new, told them they couldn't do that unless they paid for it. You can't have an unbalanced budget. You can't do tax cuts unless you can't do tax cuts unless you find a commensurate cut in revenue. So you all may or may not remember this. They decided that they were going to take, and Fitzroy's on here, so he could remember this as well. They decided to take the following February, if the revenue forecast went up in the categories where the taxes were needing to be cut, they would first dedicate the first portion of that to implementing those tax changes. And then if there's anything left over, it would go to the mayor, so to speak, for allocating in their budget. So the difficulty came in is, so Mayor Gray was a mayor when these things started, and then Mayor Bowser came in the first year these triggers, as they were called, went into place. And there was this huge discussion about, is the tax commission thing passed a year ago our current and best priorities? And those did, lots of gnashing of teeth and going back and forth. Those triggers, quote, did hold up. And I believe it was 2 or 3 years later, all of the recommendations have been put in place by revenue that was better than the forecast. That works if you're in a growing, booming economy where it's hard to estimate how good things could be the following year. But if you get into a situation where your revenues are falling, and we had a huge discussion I had huge evening discussions with Rashad and the mayor and Councilwoman Middleton. What if they go down? What if our forecast is too high? What are we going to do? So I don't think many states have that. I don't think any state has that situation where there's a revenue forecast set by the CFO that is binding on the budget that could do what was done here. So there's several things. One, they had the benefit, Mayor, of you being the chairman of the committee, knew how things pragmatically worked. And you had the opportunity of a growing economy where you could grow into the implementation of these without having to, quote, cut. You just add less, was really how that went. So that was the interesting part, was watching that process of everybody would pressure the revenue forecast to be higher so that they could put tax cuts in place, was kind of the mindset for the first 2 or 3 years. And, when you look back, it's all in place. And so I guess it all worked. But there was this push and pull of, how do I know 2 years from now tax cuts are more important than adding revenue for this particular category?
And speaking of administration, you're now no longer in office here in DC. Your candid assessment of commercial real property administration in particular, and just the tax code in general, administration-wise. Some thoughts you want to share with us?
Yeah, so I'll throw one out that never got traction, and I never quite understood why, and I'll explain why it would be wise maybe to consider it. Between 2015 and 2018, I believe, the DC has the most modern tax system of any state in the United States. They have, you can do everything online: income tax, property tax, sales tax, franchise taxes. Everything is in a new modern tax system. You can file your own appeals online for property taxes. You don't have to go in. You can literally do everything from home because this system has now been put in place. The one area that is automated, but it's not rational, I don't know how else to say it, it never has been, and why it never got any traction, is you can now file so commercial property, and I see Jody in the room, and we've had some of these discussions with the developers roundtable that I would get invited to on occasion, is your commercial tax assessment is your net operating income divided by a cap rate. Very simply put, the debate is, what's the cap rate, and you're taking the reported information from the commercial developers, commercial property owners, of what their net operating income is. And there's always debate about, is it cap rate too low or too high, which drives what the assessment is. But and I don't remember the exact dates, Fitzroy could help me with this. We send out assessments like in February, I think like around now, and we don't yet know what the 2022 net operating income is. So as soon as those assessments go out, every single person that's got a minuscule of a brain will file an appeal because the data is over a year old. So we don't choose to wait a month or a month and a half to send the assessments out and change the property tax calendar. We send assessments out knowing they're wrong 30 days after we send them. So everybody appeals them and people make money based on those appeals. And the developers or the commercial property owners are paying for an appeal they shouldn't have to file if the data is more current. And so just changing the calendar could get data that's only 3 months old instead of a year and 3 months old, so that the assessment is more accurate. I think, as I tried to say to commercial property owners in the numerous meetings and discussions I had over my 7 years and 3 months time there, is we're not, the CFO is not trying to raise revenue to the maximum amount for the council. That's not our role. And Glenn, I'm sure, is learning that, and Dr. Gandhi and you before that. It's to get it right. It's to be fair and get the number as right as possible. And it is what it is. The council gets what they get based upon a fair and full process. But you have a process that immediately upon sending it, it's wrong because the data is old. And so most people will appeal, but they're really the smaller businesses don't know to appeal, and they're kind of taken advantage of. So moving the calendar would reduce the appeals. That would eliminate a certain business group in DC getting less money because they wouldn't be doing all the appeal work. That's my candid, blunt comment on that. But the commercial property owners would pay less because they wouldn't have to appeal so much. And DC staff, the tax division is staffed for this inevitable immediate appeal that's going to come from every single person. So you've got a staff staffed for a calendar that doesn't make any sense. You've got every property owner needing to send an appeal and spending that time and money and process. And there's a calendar that has been discussed with the developer roundtable. It's been discussed with some council members. It just never goes anywhere. And if I were on the commission, that would be one of my recommendations. Make it where it's as efficient and effective as possible, and as fair as possible, and as current as possible. And this is going to become even more important if, as these leases roll off on the commercial side, and most likely the values are probably going to go down some. You're gonna want it to be right. You're not going to want it from being a year and 3 months ago. You want it to be current. So that's the biggest. I spent a whole summer where we were having problems with the commercial property appraisal process, and I spent a whole summer set up an office in the middle of the appraisal unit on the commercial side and the residential side, and went through all the policies, all the practices, all the calendaring, all the training, how supervisory worked, and we made some major changes in that summer. And this is the one that came out that just has never went anywhere.
Like bank reconciliation, but did we try to implement and then we retreated on triennial assessment? What's your view of that?
We did, and some states do it. DC has the staff, and it has the resources and has the process to assess every year. Triennial assessments can cause huge changes in property tax bills whenever that thing comes around every 3 years. So I would, in the rapid change of property values that happened in DC during the 7 years I were there, that would have been a big, choking point when suddenly your bill went way, way up. DC is one of the few places, because of their processes and their systems, they can do annual assessments. So you're always paying the market. Triennial, you're going to get big jumps that could be very painful.
Other questions folks have for Jeff? Well, Jeff, enjoy it out there in Kansas. We miss you.
Miss you guys. Nice to see you all.
If I'm ever out there, I'll give you a ring.
Fly into Kansas City, I'll pick you up, take you to a basketball game. So just let me know.
If Jeff could stay on the call for 2 seconds later, I should have talked about in mine how helpful ORA was during the process. We sent them a ton of revenue estimate work. They did it all. Of course, ORA does not make policy recommendations, and they never ever would. but they did kind of nudge us in the right direction of when we were trying to figure things out. And there's no way 2013 would have succeeded without the work of that office and all the incredible work that they did.
I would echo that. Fitzroy Yesson was there at the time and other folks. And yeah, that's a phenomenal group of people, and many of them still there. And yeah, you want to rely on them again. So you give the district something they can implement, and or they can help you with that. So my thanks to them while I was there, and there's a lot of great people there.
Sequentially, it's not a snapshot. You know, we're in a real dynamic state right now, so we need to take that into account in our deliberations, right? We're not in a static
We
situation.
have several scenarios of recommendation.
Yeah, like we had triggers, right?
Right.
Something, I'm not, without being too cute, you know, we need to, yeah. And the other is, need to really act like we're in uncharted territory and start soliciting some good information where we can find it.
And something that gave me nightmares when it happened. Right, so part of what we did was we wanted to simplify, so we adopted what the federal standard deduction and personal exemptions were. And as that was going into effect, the federal government changed, right? So TCJA changed and got rid of the personal exemption and increased the standard deduction. And I spent many nights, because I was part of that low income group, the group that was playing with the income tax a lot, trying to understand what that would mean and whether people would be hurt or not by the fact that we had basically changed something that nobody was off from when we passed it, but then the federal government acted. So something else to keep in mind, and I don't think we're going back to what the world for 2017, but all of the personal income taxes on the federal side are supposed to all go back in 2025. Now, do I really think we're going to go back to a world where they're going to, lower the standard deduction?
That actually is a good segue to the question I've asked Yesham over the last few months is, in the last tax act, when SALT was eliminated, what I talked to in Yesham is that actually on net, it really didn't affect that many taxpayers in blue states like DC. Is that true?
On the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was a massive tax cut. And so high income people. I don't, especially if anyone here in this room did their taxes and figured it out, there are some people who were negatively affected, but by and large, a big tax cut for rich people is a big tax cut for rich people, even if, we did a Diswell report where we did it, we looked at like New York, Texas, and Virginia, I think. And yes, the tax cut for rich people was bigger in Texas than it was in New York. It was still a big tax cut in New York for most people.
And the reason the SALT isn't as binding is because that personal exemption, the standard deduction became so large that the number of people who were actually itemizing went way down.
Right.
And so that meant that the limit was less binding. And having said that,
I was just wondering, because what was motivating my question to Yesham was whether, like behavioral, kind of economics kind of thing, whether this was going to affect people's sensitivity to local taxes.
You might want to pass through entity tax if they're, right? There's this optional pass-through entity tax, which is a way that a number of places are getting around the SALT limit for small businesses and pass-through entities. Because if you pay your taxes at the corporate level rather than at the individual level for pass-throughs, that is fully, your state or district taxes are fully deductible from your federal taxes. And so they don't count towards your SALT limit. That was something I think we brought up last time, but the only problem with it is that it's supposed to expire in 2025.
Your way.
Yeah.
I can't resist because you were teasing him about Lawrence. I mean, Lawrence was actually the creation of Massachusetts state tax code. Lawrence, Kansas would not have existed if it weren't for an appropriation in 1856 by the Massachusetts legislature that incentivized people to go west in advance of the Kansas plebiscite. Lawrence exists because of Massachusetts legislature. Topeka.
Was this a slavery thing, or what was this?
Lawrence exists.
Get anti-slavery people in Kansas?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a code issue.
Yeah.
A $5 million Massachusetts immigrant appropriation that people west to vote against slavery. So he lived a tax creation, Jeff, so you've not gone too far from your roots.
A Jayhawk is an anti-slavery person from Kansas. That's what a Jayhawk is. It's a mythical bird, but it's actually a person that's against slavery in the state of Kansas, battling the state of Missouri mainly, which is why Kansas hates Missouri in basketball so much. It goes back to the Civil War. So.
Over to you.
All right. Thank you for a great conversation.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Scott. Thank you, Richard. Thank you. One thing I want to say is that Richard, from day one, actually from before day one, before I took this job, and I know when Becky was thinking about how to staff the commission, Richard's just been, I mean, and Kim as well, but Richard's particularly been a great source of wisdom and insight, and laid many binders of materials on me that I think are still sitting in my front hall. So thank you guys for so much. So to the extent that if you notice anything I'm doing that maybe resembles what Richard was talking here, it's not an accident. I'm trying to copy the work that Richard and Steve and the team did a few years back. So, and this conversation has been a really good segue. I sent around to commission members earlier today, and I also hand out if everybody has any got Jody, 3 documents that are they're labeled discussion drafts, and I really mean that because I'm putting them out there. They reflect what we've been hearing, what we've been seeing, things you all have been mentioning, things our experts have been saying, things we've pulled out of the 2013 deliberations. I won't spend a lot of time on the spreadsheet labeled the running list of policy options. It's very much a work in progress. Apologize for the small type. Take a look at it at some point, but it's really meant to sort of spark your thinking. There may be things on there that are valuable, that are like, oh yeah, we definitely want to focus on that. There may be things on there that you're like, well, if we're thinking about that, maybe we're thinking about this other thing. But it is our sort of working list, and we've tried to make it things that feel like actual policy recommendations as opposed to sort of general ideas. So I'll come back to that in a second. But what this is things that I can, if I squint my eyes hard enough, I can imagine what this looks like as an actual policy as opposed to sort of an aspiration and an idea. The second thing I want to draw your attention to is the document labeled guiding principles. And this was, I think, the council, there should be
It's a one pager.
it's, so there's one page, yeah, it's right next to. Find it. It's, yeah, there you go. Anyway. Is there any more of those guiding principles down there?
I'm
Yeah.
Up here.
The guiding principles document is, again, very much a discussion draft. We talked about a similar set of guiding principles in October. It was in the overview document that I put in front of everybody at that time, and folks had some good insights on it at that time. We've tried to sharpen it a little bit and to name a little more specifically some of the themes that I'm hearing in our conversations, and both around guiding principles for what kinds of tax policies we're looking for, what we want the tax code to be more like, and also how the work will be done together and teeing up on some of, I'll be interested to look back at what I wrote here to see if it matches what Richard described as being successful marks of previous commissions. And then at the bottom of that page, I just tried to kind of connect the dots to more fully illustrate the kinds of policies that I imagine might help us get to those policies. It's more illustrative than anything else. And then the third document I put in front of you is a set of research projects. I think we're at the point, you know, Erica and Yesham, when I came in, had teed up a bunch of ideas for expert briefings. A number of these we have executed on. We've heard from a lot of great folks. I think we're at the point where it would be helpful for us to step back, and I'll say who us is in a minute, for us to step back and spend some time digging into the data, digging into the research, looking around the country for other examples of what other jurisdictions are doing in order to answer a set of research questions or ideas. I'm particularly interested in sort of two categories of ideas. One is taking vague policy ideas we've had and trying to figure out what are these actually going to look like if we actually design it? Like, what are the actual options for alternative bases for business taxation, and what's the best way to do it? The other kind of question here is a little vaguer, where we're identifying an aspirational goal and saying, well, what are the possible policy options that potentially could help us get to that goal? So, for instance, attracting and retaining firms in targeted sectors is something the mayor's plan named, without a whole lot of detail on exactly what the tax policies might be that could help us achieve that goal. So it would be an attempt to assess and evaluate possible policy options to address goals. In terms of who would do this research, I think we have three folks. There is three groups of folks. There is the folks at Office of Revenue Analysis. Fitzroy and I have been talking, and they can be incredibly helpful, as I know they were in 2013, in terms of thinking about data, coming up with revenue estimates, and other folks within CFO who know the tax code inside and out and can help us think about data, but also policy ideas and options. The second group is we do have a contract, a proposal that we did that we put out a few months ago, and for bids. This is currently going through the contracting process, but I am hopeful that soon we will have a contractor, a research institute in place that will be able to do a lot of great research for us. We also have the possibility of doing other smaller research contracts with other entities, or there may be other folks who are experts in some of these areas who might do some of this research on a pro bono basis. And we do have a little bit of capacity in-house to do some of this research ourselves. Mike, myself, Becky, our great interns, and others. So I'm going to stop here, and I can take this conversation a couple of different ways. I'm really interested, like I said, not so much in, I think we should not spend a lot of time talking about the policy options. I'm interested in a couple of things. One is, are these guiding principles something that folks feel like they can buy into? They're pretty high level. And inevitably there will be trade-offs. I think Richard alluded to this, that, you know, there will be places where you're giving up some progressivity in the name of competitiveness. You are trying to make things simple, and maybe in so doing, you're making them a little less competitive. There will be trade-offs, and we recognize that. But in terms of broad thrusts of what we're interested in, are these things that we can commit to? And is this a useful set of principles? Are they too vague even to be useful? I think that's a reasonable question. On the other hand, if you get them too sharp, then you're sort of putting the cart behind the wheel, and you're trying to have deliberations before we have a chance to have deliberations. And then the second question is on the research projects. And I realize I'm not expecting you to sit here and read 3 pages of dense type, so it may be something that we pick up a couple weeks from now. But what strike you here as priorities? And what, as you skim through, is sort of entirely missing that we might want to look at?
Well,
And
one thing I would say, as a, using prerogative of the chair, there's there's kind of a critical path of these. Some of these are dependent on research that we've said we can't really do because we don't really have any conclusive answers, or we don't have any conclusive answers. I would just say, how can we responsibly look at taxing extreme wealth, for example, if we don't really know, if we're saying we can't really come to any conclusions on competitiveness of our tax system? Because to me, if you talk about a local jurisdiction with local limited jurisdiction taxing extreme wealth, to me, that's just saying, please move. Why would I? Or another one would be, and I'm not saying these are bad ideas and should be researched, I'm just saying they are dependent on the competitiveness question. Taxing transportation. You could argue that if you're going to talk about taxing transportation, you already got a beleaguered downtown, you're basically telling people not to come in.
right,
The
I guess,
competitiveness thing, I think, to me, it begs the question of digging into this competitiveness thing. And if we're gonna look at, for example, creation of wealth and pioneering new research, then we gotta, I think, break some new ground on the competitiveness question too.
and I guess I would just want you to remember that I'm writing these are research ideas in the name of sort of how would we?
Yeah.
Like what would the options be and should we? So, we could deprioritize some or take them off the table if they seem like, whoa, seems completely like, and to Rich's point earlier, these seem politically completely.
Well, actually,
pointless.
I'd be in favor, we actually would be doing a public service if we analyze them and really breaking some ground on studying competitiveness came to some conclusion. Maybe it's that, you know what? It doesn't really make a difference. I doubt it's gonna say that, but I don't know.
Or might there be some value in doing both those reports and concluding their bad ideas as well? Like just putting for 10 years to come, taking it off the table.
It is, in a zero-sum environment, if we had all the resources in the world, we could study everything. I think, Gregory, that makes perfect sense. But if we have finite resources and we want to study things that we really think that we can come to consensus with, that are going to actually achieve things that we all communally care about and agree on, and I think that's another. But Mayor, I could not agree more. This taxing transportation just reeks of a congestion tax. And if we want to kill the golden goose, let's just do that all at once. The notion of
We're already taxing transportation.
if I might just,
Yeah.
my point of view, if you don't mind. That taxing, leading to a congestion tax is not, it's going to send the signal like, don't come downtown. You already have crime issues and other issues, and you can already work from home. Don't come downtown at all, because we're going to find a way to get your last nickel. With respect to taxing extreme wealth, if we need revenue to support our community, if we are shy, it's not as if we just didn't come off nearly a $900 million surplus. This seems punitive and ideologically driven, not necessary. And I agree, Mayor. I think, many of us aren't ever going to see the type of tax we are currently contemplating. But what it does do is it starts to seed people to think, I'm next. First, it's at this level, but once they've run through all of those widow's nickels, they're coming for me. And I start to think, is this where I want to invest my time in Treasury, or do I want to go someplace else? I've not taken anything off the table. I want to hear all points of view, but I'm just giving you my points of view. I think these two are dangerous. And the thing I am missing from this, and then I'll, relent here, is what are we doing here that is going to create and build opportunities for the middle income to elevate themselves? I mean, rather than the singular focus on a particular community, we have left out the middle class and their right to be able to improve their lives for themselves and their families. And I mean across all races, genders, and everything. They matter too in this discussion of tax policy.
This is Erica. I don't think we've left the middle class out. They're actually mentioned in several places, but I wanted to just lift up that I think we shouldn't only focus on where we think this group might have consensus with one another before we've actually done some research to tell us what the impact of different policy options would be. I mean, the whole point of this is to not just go with whatever our own assumptions or knee-jerk reactions are, right? We're supposed to be doing the work of analysis and research to figure out what's what. I think that we can't do everything, yes, but having a good, robust set of research that does have a little bit of longevity, I think is a really good idea. Tax policy doesn't just happen every 10 years with the commission. And so knowing and having some good data at our fingertips later on down the road is a good idea. We have a charge that includes a whole range of goals, and they're kind of encapsulated here in these 4 buckets that have been laid out. Competitiveness is not the only one, and I don't think we need to lift one up as the pinnacle above all others. They do absolutely interact, and so that's a thing that we'll have to consider. But I think we need to actually be committed to doing the research and then come to some conclusions about what are the policies we want to try to build consensus around within this group.
Fair enough. Yeah, Yesha.
I have 2 suggestions with respect to this list. One, I think it would be, I'm not taking this ordering of numbers as any priority, but I would suggest that number 7, DC fiscal scenarios, is something that we look into sooner than later, because I think this sort of seeing how the tax base shifts can then help us understand what's feasible and what's not. And I know I mentioned this to you, Nick, that if you were to take things off this list, I would argue that taxing cannabis is probably, given the congressional opposition to it, if we are really trying to, regardless of the merits of the idea, it's not even our political choice that I would just take it out.
Yesha, one here to that, I'm surprised the council has decided it. We're not allowed to have leisure cannabis pursuant to the congressional rider. They have not prescribed the self-certification of medical use of marijuana. So you can have people self-certify, medicinal marijuana and open it wide open. I could claim a headache that day without a doctor's note, and I could waltz right in, and at 6% taxation, we could make a fortune.
I have a headache coming on. Go ahead.
But the point is, if the legislature were to make a small tweak and allow self-certification for medicinal use, it isn't quote unquote leisure.
Yeah.
And it opens it all up.
That's a good point, yeah.
And then there's the revenue for all kinds of things.
Maybe keep it down.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
No.
And bring up the gambling thing too, for everyone.
I to put a point maybe again on this issue of the transportation and the wealth. While we ought to be driven by policy and fact and analysis to the points made earlier, there's also just the perception and the politics of it. And I believe the mayor and the council member here are right that I think we should just put a period on it, that even if it is, a good idea in some aspects, the perception of it and the reputation the city gets, it's just not worth whatever we get from the squeeze. And for that reason, I would document it as something that we looked at or didn't look at, but nevertheless recommend against. And then I think in a perfect world, this list would be driven by this list, by the guiding principles. So I think everything I'm about to say is probably implicit in what the guiding principles here are, but I'm thinking this was our talking points for a press conference or meetings with council members. These are the kind of things they would want to see. So, for example, the word fairness should be up there front somewhere. So, and I think when you mean a broad, resilient tax base, I think you mean fairness, but I think people want to hear the word fairness. And I think it's not just a broad tax base, it's a broader tax base. Because you could argue that we have a broad tax base, but I think we're getting it, there are certain people that quote unquote don't pay their fair share. So that's what fairness is as well. And so I think that's gotta be a bit more explicit. I think we should talk about simple, open, fair administrative processes. The people, words people want to hear is reduce the burden, like less difficult. It's got to be a little bit more evocative of what people actually face. So it's reduced compliance burden and make it less arduous to comply, right? And then I think something in there ought to be about, and again, I think it's kind of self-evident and resilient, but let's say post-COVID, like let's just say, pursuant to what you were saying earlier about how this is different than any time before, let's just say that we're looking at things that are really different or unknown because of where we are today. And maybe the euphemism for that is post-COVID, post-pandemic. I think just saying those buzzwords will make these principles more understandable and digestible to the public.
That's a good point.
So these are our 4 buckets that you're looking at. So then possibly look at your research projects and try to align them with your 4 buckets, and then we can prioritize.
Make a cut, make a
But it sounds arbitrary, but even just go through and say, which of the principles does each of these address?
Right.
And if something addresses all 4,
And
then it's a winner, right? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, that will come through in the research though, to some extent. I mean, there are, there are equity implications to almost everything on this list. So you might say the reason we're digging into this area is because we have a hunch that it particularly gets at this principle.
Right.
So I think to some extent,
Might take a part.
there may be some that bleed across areas.
and since we're always talking about, tax broadening, right? But that's, I think, can be very important for every relief that we want to do. We've got to broaden. So number 1 there is really important. The business activity tax or the $100 per person or pilots, whatever they are, that's the only thing we're looking at that might actually increase revenue a little bit. So let's double down on number 1.
How far, I had asked this question earlier. In your mind now, you look at all these different states, and we have a contorted tax system because of the, lack of representation. Our system's all contorted and weird. I mean, are there any other states that you've looked at that have as weird of tax structures we do?
Weird.
Where huge swaths of your tax base are off limits?
No, I don't want to say, I mean, DC, obviously, they don't have the federal limitations. I do think that states, because of their history and what they do, have self-imposed limits. Yes, like Alaska, that relies on oil revenue almost to its, I shouldn't say almost, to its detriment, and refuses to make changes because they refuse to go beyond after having to live on it. And, some states without an income tax would rather go bankrupt than to ever have one, or some states that are progressive would refuse to change that up because it's a part of their history. It's not just their tax code. But to spin it positively, something that you have that other states don't is you have the local taxes at your disposal. You can talk about property taxes and income taxes. And with state commissions, they only get income and sales. And so they could say something, they could, maybe talk about relief, but they can't make the kind of changes that you can at DC.
And also our regime kind of like worked itself around some of these preemptions. So for example, we have the unincorporated business tax, which is sort of a commuter tax. We have the, what's that, the union station tax, property tax for.
Possessory interest?
Yeah, possessory interest, yeah. And we have high tax rates on restaurants and, parking and stuff like that.
I do think the similarity is that there are states where they're like, this is our dominant industry. How do we grow beyond it? And those are just counter questions.
Like Nevada, the fact that they would need a popular vote in 2 elections to do something like pass a broad-based income tax. Well, if you want to think about a state that was sort of really hard hit during the pandemic, right? If your whole economy is based on gambling, you suddenly don't have money, like, but they couldn't actually do anything fast because of the limits that are in place in their constitution. And they're struggling, and their schools are struggling because, you know, they have a lot of people coming in and they don't necessarily have, you know, the ability to sort of build out their schools and
So
invest that way.
when, for example, California was doing its own tax revision function, the one you set on, was there any attempt to collaborate with localities? I mean, the proposition 13 is a big problem, you know.
So there was the stuff right before COVID,
Mhm.
right, where they were trying to pass a split roll. So one of the things that California has that's hard is the fact that all property is assessed at the same rate and it only gets reassessed when it's sold.
Mhm.
But with business property, if you have, you know, 3 owners and you each leave at a different point, you can always keep that assessment. So, you know, suppose you, me and Nick were partners in something. I sell my share to Richard and then Nick sells his to Mayor Williams. That property would never be reassessed because it never swapped majority ownership, which has led to over time, California having, you know, a skewness where residential property actually is a higher burden of it, even if you can't, you know, reassess that. And so there were conversations like that. The tax commission I was on, I'm not quite sure what the point of it was. Like part of the ideas that came out and were coming from people within office would be things like, we should have a broad-based sales tax, right? So if we had a VAT, but as they were doing the calculations and seeing how low the rate was, part of it was sort of estimating it on the GDP within the state, including all the government services. And so if you think about the fact that you would never actually have a sales tax on government purchases from other governments, it just became this sort of big, you know, it was this lesson in having to say, yes, in theory, this could be how much money you could raise this easily at this low rate. But in practice, there are all sorts of parts of your economy that you would never tax. And so in DC, it's much more explicit because the federal government is not allowing us to tax certain parts of it. But there are some of those push and pulls in other places too.
There's a few folks on the phone. Glenn, I guess Jody's moved over to the phone.
I'm sorry, I have to catch a flight tonight, but I'm here.
I saw your name on the screen and I looked over to my left. I was like, wait, here's the table.
Sorry.
Well, look, I know I've thrown a lot at folks. I see David, work, a red line, working with his pen. I look forward to his edits.
Not counting how many lamps I just bought for my house. I'm renovating, I have to keep track of what's happening.
That's important too.
Sorry.
No worries. I was hoping you were making helpful line edits to the pieces. So I would love to land, the two in particular, the research projects and the principles over the next, by the time we meet next time. So, you know, you all know how to find me if you want to talk any of this through or shoot me a note or whatever, and we can have another conversation next time. We meet again in 2 weeks. It's, on the 7th. Fitz will present to us, and by that time, the CFO's revenue estimate will be out, and so I've asked him to come and talk to us about that. A couple of interesting twists. I think he's hoping to present it in the form of scenarios, so there will be some different, given the uncertainty of what's ahead. I know he's been thinking a lot about different paths the revenue forecast might go, and also I've asked to sort of, for our purposes, think particularly about the out years, like not just about the short-term forecast, but about the longer term.
That end, on number 7, on fiscal scenarios, again, excuse me for my ignorance here, but it says the new revenue forecast you're referring to will include revenue scenarios. This report will match them to expenditure scenarios. Isn't that the 5-year plan? Like what, isn't that the job of the CFO?
So this is where I'm coming in a little new. My understanding is that the current 5-year plan is helpful, but it doesn't map out different scenarios for how things might go. So I think we've used that as an input. I think there's other, so.
I just really don't want to have conflicting numbers.
Oh, right. No,
I mean,
I think the 5-year plan is the starting place for the analysis. Someone who's more familiar with that.
And one way to think about it is, for example, the 2023 fiscal year, this year, there's $750 million worth of one-time spending that are supposed to expire next year. Whether they will expire or not will depend on certain policy choices, but the biggest reason they're one-time is because we cannot afford to pay for them in perpetuity. It's like the housing production trust fund, things like that. So then it becomes a term of art, like what is really the baseline and what is recurring and what, and I find it a very difficult conversation.
Is that our job to call those balls and strikes, or the CFO's job?
It's certainly
See
not
how
the
you-
CFO's job. Sorry.
I mean, I don't see how we can do, this is, gets to points that have been made. I don't see how we can do our job without having different scenarios. A financial plan is just one projection, you know, I mean, I think having a different perspectives is useful for us, and it's not challenging the CEO, CFO or it's or anybody, it's just being realistic, you know.
And I think for the fiscal projections, for me, the more, I can speak for myself, the more important thing that I'm curious about is how they see the tax bases evolve. So if we're going to see continued worsening in commercial property, there's no point in passing an increase in commercial property taxes. Like, that's sort of where I'm most interested in, not just the expenditure side.
Then the other thing, 2 weeks from now, are you still on tap to share some thoughts about tax comparisons and competitiveness?
Possibly, yeah, I can
Possibly.
get to work on that,
All
yeah.
right, we can talk later. That's a we can talk about that possibly.
Yeah.
And then I am proposing, not having that second meeting in March. And hopefully at this point, having landed some of this, giving us a little bit of a break on the staff.
Well, it's the only two meals I get each month.
Digging in. We'll send one of these lovely salads over just for you.
So the whole idea, like last time, we had dinners at Tabard, like, is that off the table?
You wouldn't go.
I don't,
Not to there, that's their.
no, I'm not saying for me. I actually thought it was a useful activity to have a social kind of activity going on.
We can't do that because, we would have to invite the city to the dinner.
Okay, that is much.
Unless one of us paid for it privately, no?
You have to make sure no official business was discussed.
Okay.
It'd be really hard.
They're not impossible, though.
Have to be social topics.
Yeah.
Or not tax topics.
I mean, I'm open to having a televised dinner, we can.
Could you imagine?
Live from the captain.
You wanna watch us eat dinner.
We could all walk in with the gowns and tuxes on, you know.
Pretend it's a chamber gala.
But, you know.
I should have brought wine like Glenn.
There you go.
You did it right.
Any other questions anyone has?
That just came on video. Did you want to say something, Glenn?
No, I just demonstrating what it's like to have remote dinners. I'm finishing my wine and Italian food here. So good to be with you all tonight.
I think we're done.
Bye.
Oh my God.
Thank you.
Thank you.